This is Canon's Rebel 8Ti, also called the EOS 850D throughout much of the rest of the world outside the United States. It is a marvelous little camera. It sells for about $750 today in the United States as of June 2020. The beautiful thing is it takes pictures just as good as my much more expensive Canon 90D. So let's take a look at some of the pictures. I love the colors I get from Canon. This is a shot with my 100 to 400 millimeter LIS2 lens at 170 millimeters, wide open at f5, handheld at a 3/20th of a second at auto ISO 200. I just love the way the pictures look from all of my Canons. The beauty of Canon is much better than my Sonys or my Fujis. All the Canon cameras look great. They have for the past 10 years. Every Canon camera has pretty much the same picture styles and picture controls set similarly. They all match, and so I get the same matching results from my EOS 5 DSR state-of-the-art full-frame camera as I get from this little Rebel. It's super sharp. Here's a shot of a water meter. This is made with an old, used, about $100 lens from the 1990s, my 28 to 135 millimeter. And the Canon T8i has automatic lens corrections, which sharpens up the old lenses because it knows what lens it has and applies the appropriate corrections. Here's a shot with my EF 16 to 35 millimeter f4 LIS. Honestly, I would have used the 10 to 18 millimeter if I happened to have it in my bag, but I didn't. But even using the wrong lens, a full-frame lens for a wide-angle effect, it looks great. The key is, with my Canon cameras, I get the colors I love and the tones I love, and that's why I love shooting my Canons. All the pictures you'll see here are shot with my T8i set in its standard picture style, and it is set to +4 for saturation. Pictures look great. They look better than the Leica Q2 that cost $5,000 that I reviewed recently. Colors are much better on this camera to my preferences for photographing everything other than portraits. I like to set the saturation up to infinity and get the wild colors you just saw. This weighs very little. It uses a pentamirror finder. In other words, up here, this little prism is not glass. That makes the camera weigh less. It makes it cost less. It also makes the viewfinder a little bit smaller, and it doesn't quite cover 100%. So if you need to do exact framing because you're on a tripod, then use live view, which it has and works great. The difference between this little camera and the fancier cameras is it doesn't have a top LCD, which doesn't really matter. It certainly has live view. It has my favorite. Again, this camera feels just like home to me, like all of my other professional Canons. It has the quick screen. We are now in a basic setting here. I don't want to be there. If we go to the settings I use, like program, boom. There's the quick control screen I love so much on all my Canons. It has all the same controls for the most part, does the same things. It just doesn't have as many buttons. It doesn't have a thumb nub on the back for selecting autofocus zones. You can do this. However, the autofocus system works great. It's got 45 cross points. It covers most of the frame. It works very clairvoyantly. If I set it to cover the entire frame and use all of the sensors and automatically figure out what's going on, it just shoots. So I love this little camera. No, it's not as durable. If I was going to beat on this and throw it around and kick it around and splash water on it, it's not quite as tough as a 1DX Mark III, but it has higher resolution than a 1DX Mark III. So yes, this camera is better for nature and landscape than a 1DX Mark III because it's got more pixels. Although, of course, the 1DX Mark III runs at twice as many frames per second, so for anything that moves, action, running animals, you're twice as likely to get the exact frame you want. But for nature and landscape, there's nothing wrong with this. This is the fanciest, last I looked, and most expensive of the Canon Rebel series. After you get out from this and you get into the 80D and 90D type cameras, what you get is, compared to the cheaper Rebels, is you actually have a rear ring here. This ring is great. This is how you set exposure compensation on all of the Canon cameras. And it's certainly much better than having to go click, click, click up and down, which of course it also can do. Also new from the T7i, which is the less expensive version, this does 4K video. I shoot videos on my iPhone, like the video you're watching right now, so I don't worry about that. This goes up to 7 frames per second with full tracking autofocus and auto exposure, up from 6 frames per second in the 7Ti. This adds an additional crop mode, a 4:3 ideal format crop in addition to square and 16:9 crops of the T7i. This adds a new programmable AF on button that the T7i didn't have. I personally programmed this to be my AF lock, but you can program it to any of many options. This has a new 220,000 pixel RGB plus IR meter sensor. Does that matter? No, it doesn't. All the Canon meters have worked just great. There's also a new, very clever icon in the Finder, which I won't show you now. It's on the lower left. It's an LCD box in the Finder which is the most brilliant level indication I've seen today for trying to get level images. In other words, although of course you can call the level up on the rear LCD, but I'm shooting with my eye to the finder. And it's the best one I've seen of any mirrorless or DSLR camera because it's small enough that it doesn't get in your way when you're trying to compose your picture, but it's big enough and clear enough so you can see exactly what you're doing when you're trying to get your shots leveled off. You can rotate your videos in this camera after you've shot them. I don't know how many cameras I've shot where the rotation sensor gets screwed up by 90 degrees and I have to go to external software to rotate my video image. This camera has an option right in the menu system to do that to the files you've already recorded. This has a digital lens optimizer, which, as I said, is just an evolution of the existing lens optimization controls that lets my older lenses work fantastically well with this new camera. It loses the rear dedicated Wi-Fi button, which I never used, and it also loses some of the crazy scene modes in the top dial. I prefer this top dial because I don't use any of the scene modes, in other words, portrait, landscape, sports, etc., but you have all those scenes available still at the scene position. You just program one of them. I prefer the cleaner look. Actually, I love this. Compared to some of my other cameras that have a lock button, I never knocked this button on top by accident. So I actually prefer this button. It's a big, fat, meaty button. It is plastic, but the key is it just works and it's nice and clear and easy to read. I do miss not having C1, C2, C3 here. That's my biggest peeve about this camera is that I don't have that. But most people don't even use those settings, so don't worry about it. If price matters, if weight matters, again, the picture quality in this camera is just as good as every other Canon digital single lens reflex. The overall ergonomics are great. This camera just goes. It doesn't get in the way. It doesn't have the horrible menus of Sony and Fuji that even their factory people usually can't figure out, except under great effort. The menu system on this is easy. In fact, to get from different major groupings, just press the Q button, and then once you're there, you can click down and go through those. Also, too, I prefer the traditional black background menus. If you want the simpler menus and the way the camera comes, what you would do is set the shooting screen and the menu display guided. Then you get these style menus. Personally, I want this because I shoot my pro cameras all the time. I want this camera to match, so I set this back to standard. And I set that back to standard, meaning the old-fashioned way for the pro cameras. I love the fact that this little guy has a built-in flash. Too many cameras skip the built-in flash. Built-in flash is critical for people photographs in direct sunlight. It fills in the shadows and makes a much better-looking picture. And also for landscape shots. If you've got a very dark foreground, you would be astounded at how much of a difference this little flash can make. It doesn't matter what the dynamic range of your camera is. It's much better to just light up the shadows and get the contrast down there as well, and you get a better picture. The battery life is fantastic. It's rated like 1,240 shots, which is typical for digital single lens reflex, but that's probably about 2 to 4 times what a typical mirrorless camera would do. In fact, the EOS RP that I love very much is a full frame mirrorless camera. It uses the same little bitty battery that this camera does. This little guy here. The EOS RP is only rated, I think, about 200 or 300 shots, where this is rated 1,200 shots. This even has a depth of field preview button, just like the big boy cameras. This has electronic image stabilization for video, but it doesn't have any built-in stabilization for still photos, which is good. Much better is to use the in-lens stabilization, which I find to be far superior to Sony's shift the sensor around, because the shifting sensor around sounds good, but it doesn't work very well for wide-angle lenses, and it doesn't have enough shift for really long telephoto lenses. It even has a mic input jack. It doesn't have a lot of jacks. It has one for the remote, and this is the microphone input. You've got HDMI and you've got USB. It does not charge via USB. You have to use the external charger that's included to charge the battery. Another great thing about this little camera is Canon is a first-class operation. They don't export their stuff to be manufactured in the country with the cheapest possible unskilled communist or third world labor. It's made in Japan, in the same country it's designed. So it's made by a company that actually cares about quality. And also Canon cares about us, the customers. I'm in the United States, and when I call 1-800-OK-CANON, punch through the menus to tell them what you're calling about. When I have to call them to ask a question, it's usually pretty intricate. They know the answer right off the top of their head. Another reason I love Canon above every other camera brand. What's bad? There's not much bad, considering you're paying half as much for this camera or less than something like a 5DSR, is that you can't set the minimum shutter speed in the auto ISO, which most of you probably have no idea what that is or why you care, but I do, because I always shoot in auto ISO. So I can't fix it to a given speed. it changes with the focal length. It slows down to a slowest value, about 1/60th of a second at wide angle. And then at telephoto settings, it's about 1 over twice the focal length. And there's no way to change that, which is good for most pictures. But I do wish I could change that, but too bad. Also, a flaw with some of the Canon cameras is, or many of them, this little light here is just a self-timer blinker. It's not an autofocus assist light. The autofocus assist is this annoying flash. A lot of Canons, this one included, fire this flash off with multiple bursts, which is even more annoying than this little autofocus assist LED might be if this was an autofocus assist LED, which it's not. Of course, if you use a full-size grown-up flash with an infrared illuminator, then that would work for lighting up for focus assist. A couple of other things that are missing that are minor. It has no automatic brightness control for the rear LCD. Admittedly, having it on every iPhone I've ever had, as well as my 5 DSR, I expect that, but most single-lens reflex cameras don't have that. I can't save and recall the settings on this camera to a card. I don't think any of the Canon cameras do that. There's no timed manual exposure times longer than 30 seconds. I have to go into bulb and use remote release and remote timer. Some cameras today are finally getting with the program. I mean, it's just software, letting us set times down to a couple of minutes. This one doesn't do that. But none of these buttons are illuminated, which is a rarity on cameras. But considering every phone I've had since like the 1980s does that, so I can use them in the dark, these cameras should have illuminated buttons. There's no headphone jack. There's a mic jack, no headphone jack. There's no second card slot. That's typical for these cameras. I love having 2 slots, but too bad. There's no flash pop-up button anymore. What's strange is you just flip it up. I mean, this seems pretty obvious. Duh, right? It's easy. You can flip it up from either side. I love that. As opposed to having to find the button in the dark and then hope I press it the right way and it pops up. Doesn't get any easier than this. Autofocus is clairvoyant. It works great in the pitch black. Here's a quick snap. Taken, it's at -1.5 light value, -1.6 EV at ISO 100. Although this shot is shot handheld with my 35mm f1.4 L Canon lens, handheld at 1/40th of a second at auto ISO 25,600. The focus is on the bright bomb tree. The key is I can walk outside in pitch dark, take a picture. The camera doesn't choke, cough, puke. It just focuses and goes. Manual focus works well. There's a green dot at the bottom right of the finder that tells you you're actually in focus, or you can just look at the screen. We have a touchscreen. The touchscreen works pretty well. I never use it, but it does work great for selecting through all these menus. It even works pretty well for entering text like my copyright information. Although because it is a small camera, it does get and I have big American fingers, it does get a little tough to punch the right spots, but it's still pretty easy to enter text, which is something most Sonys with touchscreens bizarrely can't do. Probably the weirdest thing ergonomically about this little camera is most people don't realize it, but every shutter button, for the most part, when you push it to take the picture, you never really get a click. You just slowly pull it through the release point where it takes the shot. With this one, listen. It makes a little click, and you can feel that, which is a little odd, but that's just the way it works. The grip is as good as it can be for a little baby camera like this. My hands are pretty big. I mean, when I buy gloves, I always buy like XL or XXL size. See, my fingers aren't necessarily fat, they're just long. But the key is they're long enough that this grip is not uncomfortable, but it would be nice if it just had another 5mm or so of depth, if this went out a little further, it was a little broader. Exposure is as we always expect from Canon. It's usually right on, although sometimes when I set my camera up to hypersaturation and contrast the outdoor scenes, I might need to set it down to -2/3, which I've been doing for 10 or 15 years on all my Canons. That's just my style. High ISOs work remarkably well. As I expected, they work just as well as my 90D. It looks identical to my 90D for high ISOs. Here are the complete images. And what I love about this camera and the good cameras today is that the colors and the highlights and shadows don't change as I go up in ISO. As I go up in ISO, everything looks the same. And when you look at the whole picture here at a reasonable size, the size of your screen, you'll notice everything's still sharp enough. It looks fine. You want to use any of these ISOs that you need to get a sharp picture. You don't want to have a blurry picture because you use a slower shutter speed in a vain attempt to avoid some graininess. In this case, it looks great, pretty much the same up to ISO 25,600. When you get to ISO 51,200, you'll see it does get a little more mottled and the blacks become a little bit gray, but if you need it, use it. Now here's a 10 times magnification. This is a 600 by 450 pixel crop. That's from the right-hand side, just of the clock. And you'll see what happens as the ISO increases. is that the grain doesn't really get worse, but as all digital cameras, the noise reduction, which is smoothing out the grain, is also smoothing out the fine details. So you'll notice a little filigree stuff between the digits on the clock starts to go away. And when we get to the highest ISOs, all the details are gone. This is normal. This is a pretty good looking camera as things go. And I said it looks identical. You can go to kenrockwell.com and look at my reviews where they have the original sample files for all these at the various ISOs. Compare them to other cameras, looks the same as the Canon 90D, and it's far superior to the $5,000 Leica Q2 that looks awful at $25,000 and $51,000. Here's another sharp shot made with my $100 28 to 135 IS USM. With the automatic lens corrections, it is just so sharp, as are all the older lenses used properly. And that's it. The Canon EOS Rebel T8i is a great little camera. It's got no rough edges, nothing bad or glaring about it. It's a wonderful camera. Canon has been doing these EOS digital cameras for a lot of years. And unlike the newcomers like Sony and Fuji who are still getting their act together with crappy menus, I love shooting my Canon cameras. So if you think you want this, you're going to love it. Don't even look at it as a beginner camera. This can be the basis of professional operation. You can earn a living with this if you know what you're doing. And if you don't know what you're doing, doesn't matter what camera you have. So by all means, if this is your budget, if you think you want one, if you value lightweight over having to schlep a lot of heavy cameras around, hiking or backpacking, by all means, if you think you're considering this camera, I'm sure that you will love it. Thanks again for watching Ken Rockwell and kenrockwell.com and kenrockwell.tv.